Hi friends, I hope everyone's doing well. In my last video, I used leftover scraps to create 3 collages, but I still have plenty left. I'm continuing the art session in this video, aiming to use as many of these leftover scraps as possible. My plan is to use only these scraps. If I think it's necessary to use paint or markers, then I want it to be a minimal amount. 2 more things before we get started. There are just 6 blank pages left in this art journal, and my goal is to complete it during this art session. Also, last time I didn't have any designs thought out ahead of time. This time I'll be using one basic composition style per collage. I have 2 separate videos talking about basic composition styles, so I won't be going into detail in this video. I'll link those videos in the description area below if you're interested. So let's get started and see how many collages I can create. For each collage, I'm pulling scraps ahead of time. I'm giving myself some leeway if I need to pull more later to complete it. My mindset is to go into each session to use as many scraps as possible while creating a collage that fits into the chosen composition. I like to mark a guideline 1/8 inch from the gutter. This guideline helps me to remind me not to collage too close to it. The collage could get damaged when the journal is closed. Also, I suggest putting a piece of paper or wax paper behind the page you're working on. This lessens the occurrence of any paint or glue or any other medium getting on the other pages in the journal. This collage will have a cruciform composition. I like to design the composition so it's off-center or uneven. I feel this design makes the collage more interesting. I pulled paper options to use as the ground layer first. Once that layer is glued in place, then I'll pull more papers for the cruciform shape. Typically, I like using a whole piece of paper for each quadrant, but you can certainly use multiple papers. The papers I'm using are relatively large, so I'm using as much of each paper as possible. Also, you can leave some of the substrate showing as a guide for the papers that will form the cruciform. Before I forget, I'm using Mod Podge for the adhesive, which will be applied off camera. Also, these sessions will have a mix of narration and music. Now that the ground layer is glued in place, I'm pulling papers for the cruciform shape. Since the ground layer is light and bright, I decided to pull papers that are mid to dark value for contrast. I usually start by placing mid to large elements for the arms. It's a way to lay out the shape. Then I'll work on adding other elements that are smaller, thinner, or longer. I'm constantly being mindful of varying the size and shapes of each element. I want to point out that not all the elements will be placed vertically or horizontally. Adding one or more at a diagonal adds an interesting detail to the design. I noticed that I didn't pull enough mid-tone value paper, so I went back into the container to select a few. I made the quick decision to add an element using the bright yellow paper from the ground layer. I thought it was a fun detail to add to the mid to dark value cruciform. I like how the bright yellow element tied the ground layer to the cruciform. I decided to add a small bright pink element from the other paper represented in the ground layer. One final small, thin, dark element and this collage is done. Here's the final collage. It has a strong cruciform shape. I like how some of the elements are on the diagonal. Also, I like the addition of the bright yellow and pink accents on the cruciform shape. Here's the grayscale version so you can see the light, mid, and dark values. I pulled papers that lean more muted for this next collage. It will have a grid composition with 9 sections with at least 3 layers of papers within each one. It won't be a perfectly measured grid, but I'm adding light pencil marks as loose guidelines. As I mentioned previously, I prefer an uneven design. I'm alternating between papers that are light, mid, and dark in value for each layer, also some with a pattern and some with a solid color. Another option would be to use either all light or all dark papers for the first layer, then alternate light and dark papers on top, and maybe add a few mid-tone value papers as well. You'll notice that I will cut some of the elements a few times to get the size and shape the way I want it. Even though I want the grid to have an uneven design, I don't want it to be wonky looking. Not that that's a bad thing. Wonky grid designs are fun, but it's not the design I want for this one. After the base layer of papers are glued in place, I decided to trim the edges. I like to do this step if I want a good visual of the space I'm working on. This helps me with deciding on the placement of the next layer of papers that are slightly smaller than the base layer papers. Most of these papers will be placed slightly off center. After this paper layer is glued in place, then I'll add one more layer of even smaller papers. I decided to have only 3 layers of paper for each individual grid shape. I wanted to make sure enough of each paper is visible. You can certainly add as many layers as you want. I like how this muted grid composition turned out. The combination of pattern and solid papers are a visually pleasing design. Here's the grayscale version. This collage will have an L composition. It's a common one used for landscapes, but it can produce a very pleasing design for a collage. I decided to pull papers that have a high contrast so it's easy for the viewer to see the L shape. My plan going into this art session is that the dark values will be used for the background and the light to mid-tone value papers will be the L shape. I quickly changed this plan when I decided to use a light value paper in the upper right corner. I don't want to spoil the outcome of this collage at this early stage, but keep this in mind as you watch me create it. I'll add music and come back to discuss the final collage. Here's the finished collage. I don't know if you noticed, but there's actually two strong L shapes. The light to mid-tone value one, then right above it is a smaller one that's in purple. I don't think I've ever created an L composition that has two L shapes. It's more detailed and takes the collage up a level. It may be easier to see in this grayscale version. Do you see it? The next composition is called a triangle, or I have heard it called a pyramid. Either way, the shape is the same. The apex can be dead center or off center. As you can probably guess, I like it when it's off center, even if it's just slightly off center. The blue and green papers will be the triangle shape, and the pink papers will be the top section. I'm not sure if I want to call it the ground layer or background layer. This composition is used a lot for landscape, so it could be called the sky. Before I add music, I want to point out that some of the decisions about the paper selection or placement of the element came quickly to me. You will see that some elements weren't glued down right away. Either I was unsure of the placement or another element or two was going to be placed slightly under that element. I like the look of overlapping elements, especially if the paper is torn. Once it's completed, I'll come back and discuss the final collage. This is a simple triangle composition collage, but I think it's successful. It's easy to recognize the composition. Also, I love all the different patterns in the triangle shape. The grayscale version is a bit harder to recognize the composition. It does show all three values though. I tried to pull as many smaller scraps as possible for this next collage. I still have a lot of scraps left in the container. I was really attracted to the security envelope scraps and the Thomas Guide Street scraps. Both will be used as the ground layer. I like that the security envelopes are in all three values, light, mid, and dark. Also, I thought the color palette of those scraps with the color scraps would create a good contrast. For this one, I decided on a horizontal composition with straight edge elements. You'll see that most of the elements were placed horizontally. To add a twist or unexpected detail, I placed a few going vertically. Not too many so it would change the composition's overall look. Typically, I prefer the main group of horizontal elements slightly above the center of the substrate. As you'll see soon, I started placing some of the elements over the center of the substrate trailing down. I like how some of the security envelope's ground layer is incorporated with the horizontally placed colored scraps. I don't want to give too much away at this point, but I wanted to explain a bit about the design before adding music. I'll come back once the collage is finished. This is one of my favorite horizontal composition collages that I've created. I like the contrast between the security envelopes and the Thomas Guide scraps with the colored paper. I like that the horizontal elements cover more of the surface instead of being concentrated at the top. I like the twist of having a few vertical elements, but the collage still reads as a horizontal design. I think the grayscale version can stand on its own. Let's continue to the final collage. This is another composition that I would consider simple. It's the diagonal. I'm drawing 3 diagonal pencil lines as the guide for the placement of the scraps. As you may have guessed, the main diagonal is not going to be exactly from one corner to the other. It'll be slightly off center. I want to push myself to create a complex collage using as many scraps as possible, since this is the last one, along with being mindful of having elements in different sizes and shapes, mostly on the smaller side. Also, the scraps will be cut instead of torn. I'm starting at the opposite corners and working my way to the main diagonal area, overlapping elements as I build it. Also, my plan is to have a high contrast with only a minimal amount of mid-toned elements. The main diagonal will be the lightest value, with the ones on either side to be mostly dark value, with a small amount of mid-tone value papers. This is one of my favorite diagonal composition collages. I really like the overall design. The overlapping elements are visually pleasing. I love the color combination. All of the different patterns work well together. The grayscale version is striking as well. There's still a good amount of scraps left. Instead of making another video right now, my plan is to go through the container and take out scraps that I want to include in ephemera packs for my Etsy shop. I haven't added any new packs in a while, so it's time. I hope you enjoyed watching another leftover scraps video as much as I did making it. I'd love to hear if you have a favorite collage from this group. Thanks for watching. Take care.